As Alex and Bella mentioned, the year 2020 was an enormous focus for this community because of US elections. But so much of the work that went into protecting those elections, especially by civil society and private industry, was built on the lessons and efforts for international elections in 2017, 18, and 19, including in the European Union, India, Brazil, Kenya, Mexico, Colombia, South Africa, Tunisia, and so many other places. But if you thought 2020 was intense, 2024 makes the last US election look easy. Imagine if all of the elections that occurred in the years I just mentioned happened in just 1 year. And that's what we're in store for in 2024, making it a defining year for democracy around the world. I turn now to DFR Lab non-resident fellow, Katie Harbath, joined by global election experts to discuss.
Thank you, Graham. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this important discussion. As Graham mentioned, 2024, we're going to see an electoral tsunami of major elections, not only with the US presidential election, but those in India, Indonesia, Taiwan, the Ukraine, Ghana, Mexico, the United Kingdom, European Parliament, and many others. It's a geopolitical moment that is going to be defining for the future of democracy and the internet. And that's not even to mention the other elections that we will see coming up in the next 2 years. I've got a wonderful panel here to join me in on this discussion. We have Dhruva, who is the director of the US Initiative of the Observer Research Foundation. We also am joined by Julia Brothers, who is the Senior Advisor on Elections at the National Democratic Institute. And hopefully, time and internet providing, we will also have Dr. Lorenzo Cordova, who is the Counselor President of the National Electoral Institute in Mexico. And then hopefully Adayat Hassan, the Director of the Center for Democracy and Development. If they're both able to join us, we will slot them into the conversation as we are moving on. But I want to start, we have a lot to get going on. And also, if you have questions for us, please go to the Socio platform and be submitting those. We're going to leave 15 minutes at the end to take audience questions. Dhruva, I'd like to start with you and looking ahead to the national elections that will be happening in India, also the state elections that will be happening before those in 2024. What are the trends that you're keeping an eye on, and what threats do you anticipate the integrity of elections will face?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is a great panel and a really important topic. I should say at the outset that I'm not an expert on elections per se. I run a think tank now, ORF America, based in Washington, DC, affiliated with ORF, which is an Indian institute. But a lot of the work we do is on the intersection of geopolitics and technology, and obviously the issue of elections and the role of emerging technologies, both for good and not so good purposes, is obviously a very important topic. In India, it has particular salience. Every Indian general election is the largest organized political activity in history, just because the population keeps growing. So it's an enormous gargantuan exercise every time. The next election, 2024, it will have about 1 billion eligible voters. The last election had about 915 eligible voters. And they will be, based on, again, recent trends, we have about 2/3 turnout, so about 67% turnout in the last election. So we're looking at something like 650 to 700 million votes that will be cast in 2024. There's some things, I was based in India during the last election in 2019, and I think there's some things that are quite positive in the sense of how India's approach to elections, some of the practices, and I'll get into that. There are obviously some major downsides and some risks, and I think it's good to keep those in mind as well. On the plus side, there's a great deal of enthusiasm and faith in the electoral process. High voter turnout, high enthusiasm. Polls suggest that particularly younger voters actually are very keen on voting, which stands in contrast to much of the developed world, where those numbers are flagging, and again, polls indicate a certain wariness or about faith in democracy. So that's, I'd say, one of the good news. There's also an idea that vote is, that people have the right to vote. So the idea of election suppression, that has plagued a few other countries, isn't as much of an issue in India. I'd say the other big positive, the second big positive, has been the innovation by the Election Commission of India, which is an autonomous body, in terms of constantly improving the mechanics of elections. And so they were, the Election Commission of India was sort of a pioneer in the use of indelible ink, for example, in terms of getting voter rolls in the 1950s, and at a time when India was much poorer, much more poorly resourced. But more recently, in terms of electronic voting machines, the ECI has really been a pioneer in that respect. One of the things they've done is, because there were questions about the integrity of electronic voting machines, was to actually develop something called a voter verified paper audit trail, VVPAT. And this is a way, I mean, just to briefly explain how that works, it's when you go in to vote, you press a button to indicate your selection, you get a paper printout that you can see in a sealed box that drops into a ballot. And so you can see that your vote is actually going to the party that, or the candidate that you want to vote for. So in the event that the results are challenged in any way, there is a way of accounting for it, and there is a paper trail that is created. So that was done, that was tested at the state level during some state elections, and it was actually implemented at the last general election, and that helped to reinforce faith in the process of voting during with electronic voting. I'll briefly just describe the two downsides. I think there's a lot that India is doing right. One of the things they've done also mention is set up a training institute called IIIDEM, the India International Institute for Democracy and Election Management, which has trained over 1,000 election officials from over 30 countries over the last decade. So there is a sense of at least demonstrating to the rest of the world capabilities. The two downsides, I would say, are the two risks. One is in terms of election financing, which is something that has been opaque for some time. The nominal limits on election financing are so low that they're commonly flouted or gone around. So that's an area where, for the time being, all the parties are quite content with the status quo, which is a somewhat opaque process. But there are questions about whether that could open the door to foreign interference in the future. The second and bigger one, perhaps more relevant, is on concerns of misinformation. And this is less to do with, again, the misinformation on the mechanics of the election itself, and more with the general atmosphere. And so, you have seen, smear campaigns, dirty tricks, and all that, which existed in the pre-digital age and has only been accelerated or accentuated in the post-digital age. But there are concerns about how that could play out, and this is leading to two kind of slightly different problems. One is the concern about foreign interference in that process that would tip the scales in favor of a particular candidate or party. But the other concern is really about the legitimacy of the platforms themselves, and questions about whether a Facebook or a Twitter or YouTube, which are platforms used for election campaigning, should be somehow under Indian law or subject to Indian law, and the relationship there. And that is a particularly touchy issue that is being argued, including in the courts right now. So I'll leave it at that. I think those are some of I would say the two areas that are of particular concern: misinformation and election financing. Although there's a lot of other elements that are grounds for great optimism.
Thank you for that. I want to welcome Dr. Cordova to the conversation. As I mentioned, he is the counselor president of the National Electoral Institute in Mexico. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Cordova.
Thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation to the Atlantic Council.
If I may, I'd love to turn to you. And we were just talking about how many elections are happening in 2024 around the world. And Mexico will obviously have their presidential elections that year, but there's also many state and local elections that are happening between now and then as well. And we're wondering if you can share with us a little bit about some of the threats that you're paying attention to and the things that you may be worried about as we go into the next few years.
Well, yes, I would like to refer not only about the threats we are facing as the Mexican democracy, but I think right now the times in which we were thinking about the threats of the new democracies, which were different from the ones of the consolidated democracies, are gone. Right now, we are facing, as a democracy all around the world, mainly the same threats, the same challenges. So I would like to refer 6 of them, just very specifically, that I think are, the threats that all democracies and electoral systems are facing all around the world. The first one is the one who has to be with the with a larger political polarization, which is right now, not only in the region, in Latin America and in American region, but it's all around the world, right now is aggravated with an unprecedented doses of intolerance discourses. I mean, it's not the same. It's natural that the electoral contest will be polarized. I mean, the elections are for that. Campaigns are just to improve contrast besides the people, the citizens. But right now we're facing. I mean, and that's, I think, the main issue we have to take care of. The polarization discourse increased with this intolerance discourse. When you see the one in front of you, not just as a contender, but as an enemy, we have problems. And we have, the breeding ground that we already saw in many experiences last century that anticipated some of the worst authoritarian experiences. The second threat is the one who has to see with the fact that the political party system is having huge difficulties to challenging the claims, the social claims that many sectors disappointed with the results of the democratic elected government programs are producing. So, I would like to remember that democracy needs political parties, and there can be another, complementary routes to allow political participation, but they still remain as the main institution in a democratic context. So if you don't have political parties, to say it in short, you have no democracy. The third threat, a lot of issues that such as poverty, inequality, corruption, impunity, or in some cases insecurity, that are increasing the dissatisfaction with democracy and also with elections. In Mexico, we had to run elections in a context not just a pandemic, but also a violence and insecurity, which is one of the main threats we're facing and we will face in the future, because that's a structural problem. Those are structural problems that you cannot solve from one day to another. The fourth threat, the decline of citizens' trust on their political institution, including electoral institutions. So we have to overgo this undermining, of the trust in the political institutions, and especially electoral institutions. Elections lives of certainty and credibility. So we have to go on and maximize, the credibility of institutions. Fortunately, in Mexico, INE right now, before elections, was the civil institution with a larger credibility among citizens. And fortunately, after election, we increased it in approximately 10 points that trustability, raising an inédit 71% of trust. That's one issue we have to point on. Fifth, disinformation and misinformation. I have no many things to say. I just heard what Dura just says us. I mean, that's the point of this meeting. I think we have to follow there is a huge discussion in this issue around the world. I think there is a convenient, some kind of regulation, but we must understand that misinformation should be fighted with information, not with prohibition and some other routes that could eventually put us in the condition to limitate freedom of speech and free expression. Finally, political financiation. I don't say so much about that. This is an issue that has been discussed in the last 10 years at least. That suppose obviously to increase the capabilities of the state and the electoral institutions of oversight and accountability of all incomes and outcomes in all around the world. And even if it's not a threat itself, I cannot miss to mention, that pandemic of COVID-19 will still be with us for a large time, and therefore we will run elections certainly in 2024, still with sanitary measures and preventions that and good practices that we have been achieving in the last year at least.
Thank you so much. Julia, I'd love to turn to you now. You work across many different countries through your work at the National Democratic Institute. And so I'd love to just hear some of your thoughts on that question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a lot of what I was going to say has already been touched on by our other colleagues here. But I mean, I think one of the big trends that I would say is positive in a way is that stakeholders in electoral processes are starting to view disinformation as an electoral integrity issue. And, election management bodies are looking at it that way and are preparing a lot more now than they were 5 or 10 years ago. The platforms are viewing it in that way, but we know that this goes beyond, a civic issue, and this is an electoral integrity issue. Voters are being intentionally confused. Disinformation is designed in some cases to suppress turnout and suppress participation. It can exacerbate social cleavages that can result in election violence. It can skew the playing field itself by creating unfair advantages or disadvantages for certain candidates. And like Dr. Cordova mentioned specifically, this intention to discredit the electoral process and to erode confidence in electoral institutions is a real threat. And so, viewing this as an electoral integrity issue, I think is helpful when we're thinking about reforms and interventions. And certainly from an election monitoring standpoint, we always say that elections are more than election day, and you need to look at, the voter registration process and how campaigns are going. And now, everybody sort of realizes that you cannot talk about the credibility of an electoral process without really understanding what the online political discourse looks like and what the broader information environment looks like. In terms of more sort of specific trends that I think, generally we all want to look out for is, it used to be, especially kind of after the 2016 elections in the US, the big focus was on foreign interference, on inauthentic coordinated behavior. And obviously there still should be a focus on that. That is still an issue. But certainly sort of domestic and homegrown disinformation is becoming more and more of an issue, even if it's something that maybe started at some point in a foreign interference campaign. It's, you have to deal with it in your own domestic ecosystem. And so I think having some more strategies around that and expecting that to only increase. And along with that, I think we also used to sort of see a lot of these disinformation campaigns kind of coming from very sort of unofficial sort of accounts or bodies. Political campaigns would not directly want to be associated, right, with this kind of shady behavior. So it was always, just when you're doing social media monitoring, it's always like these supporter pages and kind of closed groups that are, not necessarily officially affiliated with political campaigns. And we're starting to see that change a little bit. I think that, politicians are becoming more emboldened. They're seeing that you can generate or amplify disinformation with very little consequence. And so, I think that's something that we might see a little bit more of. And finally, I think the jump from online narratives to traditional media is much more potent than it used to be. I think, again, just kind of thinking about the 2016 elections in the US, like if you looked at like what was happening online and what was happening in traditional media, it was almost like two completely different elections and two completely different narratives. And that's certainly not the case anymore, not in the US and not in a lot of other places. So I think we also have to really be taking traditional media very seriously. And that really ends up being quite the amplifier, even of narratives that may start online, to really reach people that can impact the quality of the electoral process.
So kind of going back in reverse order, Julia, I'm going to stick with you. You mentioned that elections are not just election day. And when I was at Facebook working on the elections team, we would try to start 2 years to a year and a half before an election to be prepared for all of these different types of issues that might arise in the time period of an election, no matter whether it's like the US where it seems to be 2 years long, or in places where it may only be for a few weeks. And so I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on of what things you think that companies, social media, governments, and the media itself need to be doing now to start getting prepared.
Yeah, that's a good question. Broadly, again, I think one of the big issues here is that there are very little disincentives for political actors to, not engage in disinformation. And I think we do really need to kind of change the incentive structure where we can ahead of elections. I do think that the platforms being a bit more aggressive in deplatforming and removing kind of dangerous election misinformation content is effective. I think that if that sort of increases, then that can be a good disincentive to not engage in this kind of activity. But I think it really does need to go beyond that a little bit. I think we need to be thinking about, what are campaign regulation structures that create disincentives for engaging in disinformation. In a lot of places around the world, there are campaign codes of conduct. There are agreements that political contestants enter into in order to compete in elections. And that's a little bit different than, doing broad regulation that's like restricting certain content and freedom of expression. That's not what we're talking about, but there are these sort of rules of the game that political contestants agree to in order to compete. They agree to certain campaign finance regulations. They agree to things that might only sort of be active during a political campaign. And I think thinking about how we can sort of incorporate these like disincentives into that. And also on the platform side in particular, I think they have these, I know Facebook and Twitter now and a few others have these kind of electoral integrity standards about content around elections that I think are great. That's about you can't give the wrong election day, right? You can't give people bad information about how to vote. You can't put out bogus information about results. Like that's all great. I think those are things that I know it's really hard to implement. I think they were effective in reducing some of the dangerous content that was happening in the US, but I think we really see a lot of kind of inconsistent implementation of that around the world. And, I think kind of promoting those a little bit more, making sure every country, where people are using Facebook and Twitter are aware of these standards and policies. And also being really consistent and sort of transparent with policies around elections. I think one of the problems that kind of some of the social media platforms stumble with is they're kind of constantly changing policies to meet the new challenge and the new threat. And so that can be really difficult for watchdogs and political actors, in their home countries that are, trying to monitor the situation and trying to hold institutes and actors accountable. So also sort of some, kind of a little bit of like really thinking through policies and then putting them in place and then having that be global and not just in one place. And, that would be some of my recommendations.
Thank you. Dr. Cordova, I know Ine, I remember in the 2018 election when I was at Facebook, we signed a memo of understanding with you all, which was one of the first that we had done with another country thinking about mis and disinformation and many other issues. And Ine has been also very much at the forefront of thinking about what the role that Electoral Commission should be playing in this space. And so I'm wondering if you're willing to share some of the things that you all are working on and things you'd like to see other entities such as the platforms or civil society do in preparation for your elections.
Yeah, well, actually, we faced in 2018 election for the first time, the largest election at that time, in the middle of a global discussion about how to face and deal with the misinformation and fake news. A couple of months before, the French ones introduces a very strict and regulatory and which pointed to criminalize, fake news and misinformation and so on during elections. In Mexico, we choose a different way. We bet to fight misinformation, disinformation with information. So that supposes at least 4 main axes of actuation from the EMB, from the Electoral Authority. The first one is to understand that despite the quality of the technical capabilities, the precision and the organization of an electoral process, we should be able to become actually a very strong information institution. I mean, that's part of our role in the modern times. The best way to face, fake news and misinformation is to provide to the public precise, clear, and with opportunity information in a very plain way, to allow the people who stands on to misinformation, such as there will be a fraud, or the date of the elections will be changed. I mean, you have to improve a public discourse, and that's supposed to assume yourself as an EMB in a role of a very important information agency. I mean, that's part of the roles the EMBs right now we have to play. The second act is, as you said, Kathy, to improve a strategic alliance with the social media platforms. I mean, there are companies. They have their own interests. They have their own, political positions and so on. But that's the way in which, in the modern times, misinformation is flowing on. So you need to get an alliance. And by the way, INE was the first EMB all around the world that achieved, a memorandum of understanding with, at the time, the main 3 social media platforms, trying to use those platforms, on one hand, to identify, fake news, not any fake news, but the fake news which are potentially dangerous, and to get the people who was in touch with that fake news, so they had the chance to, through a link or a pop-up window and so on. Oh, you're interested in this information, you want to learn more? Click here, and that click bring the people to our platforms, in which, in a very easy way, with different, short videos and infographics and so on, in a very easy way, they can have information and so contrast and form their own opinion, and so on. The third axe is the alliance with stakeholders. It's very important. I'm talking not just the traditional, the conventional media platforms, TVs and radios and so on. I'm talking, digital platforms, information platforms, social initiatives, that help us to make information verification, in aim to, we have to be in contact with them, to help them, to provide them of information and the ways to make fact checking. I mean, but it's not the same thing that CNN or Fox News and so on make their own fact-checking programs. I mean, at the end of the day, Fox News is Fox News and CNN is the CNN. So it's very important that, you know, the fact-checking comes from autonomous and independent agencies. And in the last acts, during elections, I mean, particularly in election days, EMBs should, you know, display a large field operational around the country. So you have officials, electoral officials all around the country. In Mexico, we provide them with a mobile phone, and that suppose that they not just have, you know, a way, an informatic way to provide information to feed, you know, the electoral authorities, you know, systems, but also you have a camera, and any one of those officials, you know, is a sort of kind of reporter. So you can, as no other media company, you have the capability to provide information on real time. And it's not easy. You cannot distract, you know, from the electoral issues, you know, those people, but you can use them, you know, to provide information, certain and opportune information. So those are the main access, but you know, I mean, in 2018, we have some programs. Right now we have new platforms. We have to, you know, to improve our relationship right now with TikTok, for instance, and so on. I mean, this is moving every day. And also you must be to also improve new ways to face the problem, which is a problem of our times.
Thank you. Really quickly before I go to Dhruva, just a reminder that if you have questions for our panel, please go to the Socio app and go ahead and submit those there. Dhruva, going back to India, India has been more and more being also talked about on the international stage, as well as there in the country, particularly around the new social media law that was recently enacted by the Modi government, and questions around what that could potentially mean for how information, and particularly opposition voices, are potentially suppressed during not only, you know, normal times, but also in times of election. But just wondering what you are thinking of as well, of things that not only organizations within India, but perhaps the international community need to be thinking about and preparing for as we look towards what happens in India over the next few years.
Yeah, I'm actually not the best person to be talking about, I mean, the social media laws. I think a lot of, I mean, it's not just legislation and rulings and regulations, but a lot of things are actually right in the midst of being discussed and deliberated now, and it's unclear how a lot of it will shape up, certainly in time for the 2024 elections. But I think there are two kind of, you know, I think the broader problem with misinformation, and one sort of a running theme here, is how do you deal with an information environment in which bad behavior actually has a higher payoff, that the payoff for bad behavior is actually higher than the disincentives, and that I think is the sort of fundamental problem, if you will, and it's not an easy one to tackle. So two potential ways of dealing with it, perhaps these need to be pursued simultaneously in addition to other measures. One, it would be sort of top down, which is the social media companies taking more of a role, you know, instead of deplatforming, which is a very harsh measure, in terms of labeling content. And, you know, Twitter and Facebook have taken steps in that direction, which is candidates' accounts are now labeled, so people know that this is a political, you know, a political candidate. Government officials are labeled. But it may make sense to actually offer a labeled, and working with local election authorities to remove that label in the event of violations, or particularly repeated violations of some community guidelines and so forth. So, you know, that would require, again, a level of coordination with individual countries, electoral authorities but I think something like that would be perhaps and by the way, also having that reflected in algorithms as well. So I think that's kind of, it would be key to the solution. But something like that would provide again, perhaps an imperfect solution, but something in between complete deplatforming and complete non-regulation of content, so something in between. At the same time, I think we can't escape the idea that digital literacy at the citizen citizen level is necessary, and that the earlier you start on that, the better. So even at the school level, getting students to understand how to consume information online. That it's not, I found that on the internet, but what is the source for that? What is are the competing sources of information? Certain countries are already experimenting with that in school curricula, but I think ultimately you can't escape a certain element of citizen responsibility in terms of consuming information, and I think the issue of digital literacy is going to be a challenge. One of the big challenges, by the way, everywhere is that the people who are most susceptible to this are actually older voters for whom who are sort of late adopters of technology, and for whom Google is the source rather than what it is they're searching for on Google. So again, I think a combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches will have to be experimented with over the coming years to find a better solution to some of these consistent challenges across countries.
Great, thank you. So we actually have some audience questions. Excuse me. First, how can civil society deal with concerted efforts to undermine elections using disinformation coming from within the government and from elected officials? Notably, we saw this in the US, but there are parallels from all over the world. This kind of goes into also a question I was going to have for the panelists myself around, it does seem like there's new social norms that are being debated about what world leaders and others should be able to say online and what the consequences of that should be. And so how do you all think that should, this is a big question, the million-dollar question right now, but where do you see that going over the next few years? And do you think that there will be new rules or guardrails that are put on candidates and elected officials of what they can say online? I'll kind of toss this open to anybody on the panel who might want to tackle that.
I mean, I can just speak a little bit on the side of, and I'm sorry, my internet I know is a little unstable, but the role of civil society is incredibly important here. And again, I think when we're talking about accountability mechanisms, that's sort of one of the only ones that we really truly have right now. But in order for civil society's role in here to apply pressure on elected officials to behave ethically, in some way, how do we make disinformation uncool, right? And I think that that's something that really civil society and sort of citizens are going to have to do. But in order to do that too, they need support, they need information. That's why I think, some of the increased transparency efforts from the platforms has been really helpful, but I think they can probably go a little bit further in order for civic actors to really sort of hold political contestants accountable. Even when it comes to things like, who are your communications consultants? I think that that's something that we're still seeing a lot is, the use of Western-based or international consultants on these kinds of communication campaigns that can be pretty dodgy. And that's something that not only citizens of that country might want to know, but it's also something that citizens of the home country might also want to know as well. So we can hold some of these businesses accountable. So I think kind of enhancing transparency generally for information that then watchdogs and civic activists can use would be really helpful in this instance.
Dr. Cordova, yeah, I'd be curious to know how INE or what you're seeing this in Mexico.
Well, I would like to say I essentially agree with what just Julia said. I mean, I think the problem is it's a false debate if we need regulation or not. I think obviously, I think it's necessary some kind of regulation, regarding the social interaction in the digital landscape. But I mean, that's clear from my point of view. The real problem is which kind of regulation, how far we should go with regulation of the freedom of speech in the digital landscape. I mean, and we must be very careful because if we exceed in the regulation, if we try to regulate something which is unregulable, I mean, we can provoke even, private censorship, which is, I mean, probably the main problem. I mean, it's to affect, the heart of a democratic deliberation. So the point is, some kind of regulation should be established, but that should become from a huge global and inclusive discussion. I mean, you cannot leave it in the hands, of the social platforms just, but you cannot leave it, to the parliaments just. I mean, it's a global discussion. I mean, that's the main point, that the main threat which is facing democracy all around the world. And we are talking about, the main liberty, the main value of a democracy, which is the freedom of speech. That's the point. From one side, but I insist in something. I mean, we cannot just stand on regulation and believe that regulation will solve this problem. I mean, we have to develop, a digital, let me say, like that, like these democratic skills. I mean, we have to build a so kind of better environment for public conversation on social media. It's fundamental to promote civic digital initiatives, to build, as Julia said in its first intervention, a digital civic culture. And obviously, I mean, there is a responsibility for EMBs, which is, to improve all the capabilities to following the money and capabilities of accountability. I mean, the amount of money that is going on through social media or the propaganda in social media is huge, and every day it is increasing. But I mean, one thing should not be, I mean, go on without the other one. So I think on one hand, civil society, citizen skills, democratic skills to face this problem. I mean, there is a role for the EMBs, for electoral authorities, and there is also a role for the parliaments. I mean, to build these new rules, which should be, I mean, the basic rules, we're talking the rules of the game, the new kind of rules of the game.
Thank you. For our last question, Dhruva, I want to go back to you because you were talking a little bit about building up digital literacy, particularly with some of the efforts in schools, if I remember correctly. Please tell me if I misheard that. But also, so the last question is wondering, what are the areas that social media and technology can improve civil literacy or build access to the vote and improve election integrity? I know you're not an elections expert, but I'm wondering if you have any last minute thoughts on that for India.
I mean, getting out the vote is not much of an issue. I mean, in fact, I think if anything, social media has perhaps helped with that. So I don't see too much of at least in India, that's not much of a problem. The digital literacy, I think, certainly is more so, but again, it requires really starting at a low level. It's interesting to see what some European countries are doing in this regard, but it's still a very sort of nascent stage. I think the previous question actually really got at a really important point, right? Which is if elected official X says the Earth is flat, is it up to the media to report that, plain, or is it up to them to check, to correct it, to check it, to provide a counter view? Is a counter view that the Earth is round is that actually fair and balanced, or if one is clearly incorrect, is it up to a third party to govern that. And again, that gets into a very tricky question of who guards the guards. And obviously, the solution lies somewhere, a combination of independent judiciaries, regulators, parliament, civil society, media. But again, you end up for every issue, it ends up being very difficult as to who holds responsibility for holding a particular individual to account at a particular time. So all of this is a long way of saying there isn't I think part of the reason we're debating this is there isn't a single point solution for any of this, but it will require quite a concerted effort involving these multiple actors, including in cooperation with social media companies and platforms, to get to the heart of the problem.
Thank you so much. Well, we are coming up on the end of our discussion. There's a lot more that I think that we could have dove into here and thinking about the next 3.5 years. And this is just part of this start as part of the Atlantic Council's new Democracy and Technology Initiative. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. Unfortunately, Adayat Hassan was not able to get an internet connection back up and running. So that's why she was unable to join us, but hopefully we'll be able to have her as part of future discussions. But otherwise, I want to thank Dr. Cordova, Dhruva, and Julia for joining us all today. And I will throw it back to Graham in the studio.